The bell over the door of the Bluebird Diner gave a tired ding as Mark Hayes stepped in. Cold Michigan wind clung to his jacket and stung the old scar in his knee. Inside, it smelled like burnt coffee, fryer grease, and diesel drifting in every time the front door opened. A small AM radio hummed low behind the counter, static and country music. Mark didn't ask for food, just a cup of hot water. For Rex. A man in a county jacket, Drew Kincaid, blocked the aisle. He looked Mark up and down like he was trash on a boot. No handouts, no dogs. Mark stayed quiet, squared away, eyes steady. Kincaid smirked, then snapped his wrist. Coffee flew, steaming, black and bitter, splashed across Rex's back. Rex yelped once. The sound hit the room like a rifle crack. Kincaid followed with a hard shove of his boot at the dog's bowl. "Get out." For a heartbeat, everything froze. Outside, a bus hissed its brakes. Pshh! And Mark's jaw tightened like a vice. Fade to black. Title card, The Guardian of Iron Creek. Before we see how they pay for this mistake, please subscribe to support our veterans. 3 days before the diner incident, Mark Hayes and his German Shepherd Rex were already being told they didn't belong. Wind off Lake Superior slapped Mark's face and worked into the old scar tissue in his left knee. Every step on the salted sidewalk sent a dull ache up his leg. The air smelled like diesel, wet snow, and cold iron. He kept his shoulders square. He moved like a man who still remembered formation. Oscar Mike. Rex stayed tight on his right side. German Shepherd, quiet mouth, busy ears. His paws crunched through crusted snow. His nose tested the air like a scanner. They'd been sleeping under a bridge, tucked behind a concrete pylon, a tarp, a sleeping bag that reeked of damp wool, a shopping cart with a cook pot and a half bag of kibble, not much else. That morning, a city truck rolled up, chains rattling. The driver stepped out, breath fogging, smelling of coffee and gum. "New directive," he said. "We gotta clear this. Liability." Mark nodded once. He didn't argue with a man just doing his shift. He packed fast with numb fingers. Rex sat close, pressing his body into Mark's thigh, sharing warmth. The river below carried a sour, muddy smell. Overhead, a bus crossed the bridge and its air brakes hissed, psh, sharp as a slap. Mark froze. Heat and dust flashed behind his eyes. A cable snapping, metal failing, a buddy going down hard. Then the memory tried to swallow him. Rex bumped Mark's hand with his cold nose, grounding, present tense. Mark breathed in dog fur and smoke residue from last night's fire. "I'm good," he lied and kept moving. Shelters were full. The ones with space said no to big dogs. Mark didn't ask twice. Rex was his unit. You don't leave your unit. Rex hadn't come from a breeder. Mark found him 2 years ago behind a VFW haul, ribs showing. Collar cut clean, like somebody dumped him. The dog walked up anyway and sat, steady, like he'd chosen his man. Mark had been coming out of a VA clinic, smelling antiseptic and stale popcorn from the lobby, hearing a tinny TV talk about weather. Rex just leaned in. Mark didn't push him away right then. They walked toward the industrial edge of Iron Creek, where the old ore plant sat dead and dark. Red Harbor Ore Works. Rust, broken glass, wind whistling through steel frames. The place smelled of flaking paint and cold concrete. It was dangerous. It was cover. A section of chain-link fence had sagged. Mark slipped through with his pack. Rex followed, silent and alert. Inside, the silence felt heavy. Snow drifted through roof holes and melted into black puddles. Mark found a small brick outbuildings with a faded security sign. The door still shut. The window wasn't broken. Dry air, even if it was bitter cold. He let out one slow breath. Rex did a quick sweep, corners, door seam, window, then lay down facing the entrance, chin on paws. Watchdog mode, squared away. Mark sat against the wall. His back felt the bricks cold. His knee throbbed. Somewhere outside, a car radio hummed low and then faded. He split rations. Rex got kibble. Mark ate the last heel of bread. The bread tasted like cardboard. The kibble smelled better than his food, and that stung. "You're good, boy," Mark said. Rex's tail tapped once. That was the whole conversation. In the weak morning light, Mark counted his money. $73 and some change. Last cash. Last play. A damp flyer in his jacket pocket caught his eye. North Shore Storage, Delinquent Unit Auction, cash only. He stared at it until his breath stopped fogging the paper. "Hate this," he muttered. Rex sneezed, then looked at him like, "Move your feet." The storage lot was wind-scoured and smelled of exhaust and wet cardboard. A handful of buyers stood around trucks with engines idling, heaters blasting. Their hands were warm, their eyes were hungry. Mark stayed at the back. Rex sat by his boot, calm and steady, a quiet warning sign. The auctioneer wore an orange vest and talked fast. "Look, don't touch. Cash today, 48 hours to clear." Doors rolled up. Flashlights stabbed into units. Bids jumped. Toolboxes, furniture, piles of stuff the pros could flip. Mark watched and waited. "Last unit. 412, the auctioneer called. 9 months delinquent." The lock snapped. The door squealed up. A stink poured out. Mold, rot, sour cloth. The crowd leaned in, then backed away like it was poison. 50, the auctioneer tried. Nothing. 20, still nothing. He pointed at Mark. "You with the shepherd, 20 and it's yours." Mark felt the bills in his pocket. He pictured Rex's bowl. He pictured another night of ice. He pictured the old lie that had ended his career. Operator error, because truth was inconvenient. 50, Mark said. A man near a truck tossed out 60, just to be a jerk. Mark didn't blink. 70. The jerk laughed and waved off. "Sold," the auctioneer said, relieved. 70 to the gentleman and his dog. Mark handed over every bill. The receipt felt heavier than the money. When the lot emptied, Mark stepped into the unit. His boots stuck to damp concrete. Boxes collapsed into mush. Old magazines fused together. Trash bags split open, releasing clothes that smelled like a flooded basement. A broken lamp, a rusted shelf. Nothing worth saving. His throat tightened. He sat down hard against the wall, gloves over his face. Cold seeped through denim. The smell of rot crawled into his nose. He fought the shaking. Then came a sound, scratch, scratch, steady and deliberate. Rex was at the back wall, nose pressed to stained plywood. Not excited, focused, working a single spot like it mattered. "Rex," Mark said, tired. "Leave it." Rex paused, looked back, then scratched harder. A low huff, refusing the bad order. Mark pushed up, knee barking. He dug out a tire iron from the trash. The metal bit his palm through the glove. He shone his flashlight at the plywood. 2 straight dark lines ran from floor to ceiling. Seams. Mark wedged the tire iron in and leaned. The plywood tore with a dry rip. Nails squealed. The panel fell forward with a thud. Dust puffed up and tasted like old paper. A cold draft breathed out of the hidden space. Rex sat immediately, eyes locked on Mark, body vibrating with purpose. Mark aimed the beam inside. A narrow void, man-made. On the concrete floor, placed neat as evidence, sat 3 items. A small wooden box, a thick folder sealed with dark red wax, and a black metal case with 3 combination locks. Mark's pulse slowed into something steady. Not hope. Orders. Back at the security room, wind rattled the window, and his small fire barrel smelled of smoke and pallet wood. Rex lay behind him like a warm shield, ears twitching at every distant engine. Mark set the wax-sealed folder in the flashlight beam. He broke the brittle seal with his thumb. It snapped like a bone. The first line stared up at him in shaky blue ink. If you are reading this, I am dead. If you are reading this, I am dead. Mark didn't blink. The sentence sat in the flashlight beam like a live round on a table. Wind scraped the broken fence and moaned through the rusted ribs of Red Harbor. Inside the little security room, the air smelled of cold dust, scorched pallet wood, and wet dog. Rex pressed his warm shoulder into Mark's back. Steady as a sandbag, Mark read on. My name is Walter Grayson. I was too weak to do what was right. Weak. That word had weight. Walter wrote about his brother, Nathan Grayson, who found numbers that didn't match. Soil tests stamped safe while runoff stained the snow-rusty orange. He wrote about Clay Harlow, then a contractor, now mayor, who paid men in cash and favors. He wrote about inspections that looked the other way. It was an execution, Walter wrote. They made it look like his fault. A bus brake hissed somewhere. Pshh. And Mark's chest tightened. Diesel, hot metal. A memory of another report, another lie, another dead man blamed for operator error. Mark forced air in and out, slow. Rex leaned harder, fur warm through Mark's coat, present tense. Walter's last pages were clear. He hid Nathan's proof behind the false wall. He sealed it so no coward could clean it up. He kept paying storage rent until he ran out. He left one more piece. An original deed showing Red Harbor was never legally Harlow's. Mark lowered the pages and stared at the black metal case with 3 combination locks. Objective. He didn't talk. He moved. He wrapped the folder and wooden box in cloth and shoved them deep in his pack. He tested the case. Heavy. Solid. The kind you don't open in daylight. He clicked the flashlight off and listened. Wind. Distant traffic. The low hum of far-off radios. Rex's ears snapped forward. Stay, Mark whispered. Rex stayed. Before dawn, Mark carried the metal case deeper into the ore works. Snow sifted through broken skylights. The air tasted like iron filings and old oil. His boots echoed off dead machines. He found a half-collapsed trench under a rusted steel plate. He wedged the tire iron in and leaned. Metal screamed. Cold bit his hands. His knee barked. He didn't swear. He just worked. Case down into the dry dark. Sleeping bag over it, plate back, dust over the seam, field expedient hide, squared away. Back in the security room, gray light seeped through the grime. Mark's stomach growled. Rex's too. The kibble bag felt light as shame. They had to go into town. The road in smelled like salt, diesel, and lake wind. Snow squeaked under boots. A plow roared past, spraying slush cold on Mark's pant leg. Rex kept heel, tight, silent. The Bluebird Diner glowed warm against the gray. Heat rolled out when the door opened. Bacon grease, burnt coffee, lemon cleaner. An AM radio hummed with static and old country. The bell gave a tired ding. Sarah Whitaker looked up. Ponytail, red hands, eyes that had seen too much. Mark set 2 crumpled dollars on the counter. Hot water. Sarah glanced at Rex. The shepherd sat, calm and still. She poured the water, and steam rose. Mark held it near Rex's muzzle. The dog sniffed the warmth and settled. You from the bridge? Sarah asked. Mark nodded once. A kid appeared from a booth, skinny, 10-ish, backpack on the seat. Eli stared at Rex like he'd just met a legend. Mom, he started. Eli, don't, Sarah warned. Eli stopped a few feet away anyway. Rex's ears flicked, watchful. He's squared away, Eli said. Mark almost smiled. Almost. Then the door opened again. Cold air shoved in, carrying cigarette smoke and road salt. 2 men in reflective jackets walked in. One held a clipboard. He didn't look at the menu. He looked at Sarah's walls. Inspection, he said. Sarah stiffened. We passed last month. Different month, the man said. He paced and found problems. Loose tile, missing label, cracked outlet cover. Coffee burned on the warmer, bitter smell rising. The radio hissed between songs. Sarah's hands shook as she wiped the counter. Mark watched. Quiet. Still. When the inspector turned his back, Mark crouched by the outlet. Cold seeped under the door and bit his fingers. He pulled a small screwdriver from his pocket and tightened the cover. Then he pressed the loose tile flat with his palm. The inspector spun. "Hey, don't touch that." Mark stood, eyes steady. "Safer now." "Who are you?" the inspector snapped. Mark said nothing. Rex rose beside him, not attacking, just present. Sarah swallowed. "He's a customer." The inspector hesitated, scribbled, snapped the clipboard shut. "This place is on notice. We'll be back." He left. The bell rang sharp. Cold rushed in and out. The diner went quiet except for the radio hum and the grill's soft sizzle. Sarah leaned on the counter, breathing hard. Mark saw a paper on the wall, notice of hearing, stamped by the town. Under it, a glossy flyer with Mayor Harlow's smile. Iron Creek Revitalization. Eli whispered, "They're gonna shut us down." Sarah didn't deny it. She just nodded once, jaw tight. Mark noticed the back door latch hung crooked, letting a thin blade of winter air cut into the room. He walked back there. The kitchen smelled like bleach and hot grease. He tightened the hinge screws and set the latch until the door shut with a clean click. The draft stopped. Sarah slid a small paper boat of bacon ends across the counter. For him. Mark hesitated, then set it down. Rex looked at Mark first. Mark gave one small nod. Rex ate, quiet, disciplined. The smell of meat filled the air. Eli watched, wide-eyed. "He waits for orders," the kid said. Mark zipped his coat. "Good dog," he said. Sarah's voice was softer. "What's your name?" "Mark," he said. Then he tapped Rex's collar. "Rex." Eli dug in his pocket and pulled out a frayed shoelace, fingers fumbling. Mark tore a napkin into a strip and showed one clean loop, one pull, simple. Eli copied it, tongue between his teeth. When it held, the kid's shoulders lifted like he'd won something. Sarah poured a small cup of coffee and set it near Mark's hand. The smell was sharp and burnt, the kind that keeps you awake on long nights. Mark slid it back with 2 fingers. "No thanks." Sarah's voice came soft under the radio's static. "You don't have to do this alone." Mark didn't answer. He just checked the window. Old habit. He saw a county pickup roll slow past, tires whispering on slush. The driver didn't look in. He didn't have to. Rex stayed by his boot, ears twitching at the distant engine hum and the sour bite of exhaust outside. Mark turned to go. Oscar Mike. Outside, the wind hit hard and made Mark's knee ache like a tooth. Rex leaned in, sharing heat through fur. Eagle. Across the street, an SUV sat idling. Dark windows, no headlights. Exhaust curled into the cold air. Rex stopped, ears forward. A low rumble rolled up from his chest. Mark went still. Ready. Fade to black. Across the street, an SUV sat idling. Dark windows, no headlights. Exhaust curled into the cold air. Rex stopped, ears forward. A low rumble rolled up from his chest. Mark went still. Ready. Mark didn't stare at the SUV. Staring got you made. He watched the diner window instead, the slush shine, the dark shape across the street. Inside, it smelled of burnt coffee and fryer grease. The AM radio hummed and snapped with static. Sarah met his eyes. Her hands were red from hot water and winter air. "Drew Kincaid," she whispered. "Mayor Harlow's errand man." Mark nodded once. That was all. He clipped Rex's leash and moved for the back hall. Bleach sting, grill heat. The latch clicked clean. He stepped into the alley and the cold hit like a slap. Wind knifed under his collar and lit the ache in his knee. Snow squeaked under boots. Rex stayed tight at heel, shoulder brushing Mark's thigh. The SUV rolled past the front again. Slow. Hunting. Mark didn't run. Running was how things went. Foobar. He slid behind the hardware store and cut through a gap between sheds until the street noise died. Red Harbor ore. Works waited on the bluff like a dead ship. Rust smell, old oil, wind whistling through torn steel. Mark slipped through the broken fence and into the little security room. Ash and smoke ghost in the barrel. Rex swept the corners and sat facing the door. Sentinel. Squared away. Mark pulled Walter Grayson's letter. The paper felt brittle and smelled like dust. He read the lines that mattered. Nathan Grayson didn't fall. Clay Harlow paid to bury it, and Nathan had a daughter. Emily. Mark didn't talk it out. He made a plan, find the heir, give her the truth, then deal with the sharks. Morning came flat and gray. The air smelled of snow and diesel. Mark walked into town with Rex at heel. The Iron Creek Public Library sat warm and bright, windows fogged. No animals. Service animals only. Mark stopped. His throat tightened. Rex looked up, frost on his whiskers, eyes steady. He leaned into Mark's glove, warm fur anchoring him. Mark found a stone column out of the wind, granite cold like ice. He looped the leash twice, high and tight, and crouched. Guard. Stay. Rex whined once, soft and wounded, then sat. Perfect posture. Mark backed through the door until the glass shut between them. Inside smelled of old paper and floor polish. Radiators hissed. Keyboards clacked. Mark kept his cap low and slid to a public terminal. He typed like a report. Nathan Grayson, 1997, Red Harbor. Headlines. Industrial accident. Operator error. Mark's jaw set. Same script. Clay Harlow. Smiling photos. Ribbon cuttings. Revitalization. Words meant to cover bodies. Clean Harbor Alliance. Emily Grayson loaded on the screen. Mid-30s. Hard eyes. Windburned cheeks. Under her name. Opposing Mayor Harlow's private port lease at Red Harbor. Mark copied the mailing address, then stopped. Offices had cameras. Emails had trails. Phones were taps. He needed analog. He searched Point Able Lighthouse. Public grounds. Open sightlines. Frozen pier. At the desk, he bought a plain card and a stamp. Cash only. The cardstock felt thin. The pen smelled like ink and metal. He wrote in block letters. Miss Grayson, I found something that belonged to your father. Not safe by phone. Meet me tomorrow, 2 p.m. at Point Able Lighthouse Gate. Come alone. He didn't sign a name. Just a friend. He added proof. A photocopy of Walter's line naming Nathan, and a small copy of the photo, Nathan with a little girl on his shoulders. He sealed the envelope. Bitter glue on his tongue. Outside, Rex was still there. Snow dusted his back. His paws had carved half moons in the drift from holding position. When Mark stepped out, Rex stood so fast his tags clinked. Mark pressed his forehead to Rex's. Warm dog breath. Cold lake wind. Good. They walked to the blue mailbox on the corner. The metal was so cold it burned. Mark dropped the envelope in. A soft thump. Final. He didn't go straight back. He circled. He watched corners. A county cruiser idled too long at a stop sign. A pickup rolled slow, then turned away. Rex kept scanning, ears twitching at every engine note. Late afternoon, Mark slid behind the Bluebird Diner again, quick and quiet. Lemon cleaner and coffee hung in the air. Sarah looked up, tired eyes, shoulders tight. Mark didn't sit. He set a folded napkin on the counter. 2 words, stay inside. Sarah's fingers closed over it. Eli watched, anxious. Mark lifted 2 fingers, down, calm, breathe. Eli copied him. Rex sat between them like a wall. Mark left through the back before anyone could follow. Night at Red Harbor tasted like iron and smoke. Wind slapped the tin roof. Mark checked the hidden plate, untouched. He slept light, one hand on Rex's ribs, counting that steady rise and fall. Next day, he moved early. Point Able sat above a gray, angry lake. Wind screamed through pines and carried the smell of ice and fish and diesel from the harbor. The lighthouse stood white and chipped. Snow drifted across the pier boards. Mark took high ground behind scrub. Clear view of the lot and gate. Rex lay beside him, quiet alert. At 1:57, a blue sedan pulled in. A woman stepped out, coat pulled tight, hair tied back. Emily Grayson. She scanned the lot like she expected a trap. Mark stepped out slow, hands visible, Rex at heel. Emily spun. "You sent the letter?" Mark nodded. He set the small wooden box on the snow-caked rail, dark wood against white. Emily's breath hitched, fog in the air. "Where did you get that?" Mark opened the lid and slid the photo forward with 2 fingers. Emily's gloved hand trembled as she took it, her eyes locked on the picture. "My dad," she whispered, voice cracking. Down below, a heavy truck rolled and dumped its brakes. Psh! Sharp in the cold. Mark's shoulders tightened. Rex rose, hackles up, no bark. Boots crunched behind Mark, slow, confident. A laugh cut through the wind, smelling of coffee and tobacco. "Well, look at this," a voice said. The stray and his wolf dog. Mark turned controlled. Drew Kincaid stood 10 feet away, county jacket zipped high, smile all teeth. "Mayor Harlow's been dying to talk." His boots left prints. Cheap cologne cut the lake air. He smiled like he owned the horizon. Rex growled low. Mark tightened his grip. Boots crunched behind Mark, slow, confident. A laugh cut through the wind, smelling of coffee and tobacco. "Well, look at this," Drew Kincaid said. "The stray and his wolf dog." Mark didn't answer. Lake wind knifed through his coat and lit his knee with that old, deep ache. The frozen pier boards creaked under his boots. Rex's growl stayed low, steady, like a generator hum in the dark. Kincaid's eyes flicked to the wooden box, to the photo in Emily's hand. "Town property," he said. "Hand it over." Emily's breath came out white and fast. "That's my father." Kincaid smiled. "Your father made problems. Mayor Harlow cleans up problems." He stepped closer. Cheap cologne cut through the fishy lake air. "You, old man, you walk away. You forget her. You keep the dog muzzled." Rex's ears went forward. Teeth showed a sliver. Mark finally spoke, one sentence. "Back up." Kincaid laughed, low and mean. "Listen to that. He's got orders again." Then he leaned toward Emily, voice dropping. "You keep digging, sweetheart, and you'll end up like him. Operator error, tragic accident, closed file." The words hit like a shove. Emily went pale, her knees locked. Mark saw panic trying to take her over, the same way cold takes fingers. Mark moved. No drama. He touched Rex's collar, 2 fingers, heel. Rex obeyed, tight, silent. Mark nodded once to Emily. "Move." He turned and walked, not fast, not slow, squared away. Oscar Mike. He kept Emily on his left and Rex on his right, like a small patrol leaving a bad neighborhood. Kincaid followed a step, enjoying the fear. "You don't get it," Kincaid called after them. "Iron Creek doesn't owe you anything. Not you, not your dog, not her dead daddy." A bus on the highway above dumped its brakes, psh, sharp as a whip. Mark's jaw clenched. For half a heartbeat, the world tried to flip into dust and heat. Rex bumped Mark's thigh, warm fur, present tense. Mark kept walking until the pines blocked the wind. Sap smell mixed with cold snow. Emily's hands shook so hard her keys rattled. "They killed him," she whispered. "And he jokes." Mark took the photo gently, slid it back into the wooden box, and closed the lid like you close a flag case. He didn't offer comfort he couldn't afford. Emily swallowed. We go to the police. Mark shook his head. One sharp motion. No. You don't know what this is, she snapped. Mark's eyes stayed calm. His voice stayed low. I do. He tapped his temple. Same script. Emily stared at him, then at Rex, who stood with ears up, scanning the woods like he could smell trouble ahead. Then what? Mark looked toward town, toward the warm lights that couldn't defend themselves. We protect the soft targets, he said. Soft targets? People they can hurt, Mark answered, and that was all. They moved back into Iron Creek by side streets. Snow squeaked under boots. A plow passed, spraying slush that smelled of salt and diesel. Mark didn't look at the big buildings. He looked at reflections in windows. He listened for engines that didn't belong. The Bluebird Diner glowed amber against gray sky. The moment the door opened, heat rolled out. Bacon grease, burnt coffee, lemon cleaner. An AM radio hummed under the chatter, all static and old songs. Sarah saw Mark and went tight in the face. They were here, she whispered. Mark didn't ask who. He glanced to the corner booth. Eli sat hunched over homework, pencil tapping fast. When he saw Rex, his shoulders dropped a little, like the dog was a blanket. Emily hovered behind Mark, eyes sharp, not used to being hunted. Mark gave her a small hand signal. Easy. Stay behind me. She obeyed, jaw clenched. The bell dinged again. Cold air shoved in. Two men walked in with clipboards and reflective jackets. They smelled of cigarette smoke and wet wool. They didn't look at the menu. They went straight for Sarah. Health and safety follow-up, clipboard said. Back area, now. Sarah's voice trembled. We passed last month. New report, he said, and pushed past her like she was furniture. Mark didn't posture. He just followed at a distance. Rex padded silent. The kitchen was hot and loud, grease popping, bleach stinging the nose. One man pointed at anything. Violation, violation, like he wanted to hear himself talk. They stopped at the back door. Clipboard tugged the handle until it rattled. He smiled, satisfied. Loose latch, unsafe, that's another. Mark stepped in and tightened it with one clean twist of the screwdriver he carried. The metal clicked. Draft stopped. The smell of winter faded. Clipboard snapped his head around. Don't touch that. You staff? Mark shook his head. No. Then you're trespassing, Clipboard said, voice rising like he wanted a fight. Mark didn't give him one. He stood still, silent. Rex sat at his boot, eyes on the man's hands. No barking, just pressure. Clipboard cleared his throat and changed tactics. He slapped a notice onto the prep table. Fresh toner smell. Sarah Whitaker, repeat violations, hearing at town hall. Fail to comply, we shut you down. Sarah's hands shook as she lifted the paper. This is my only job. Clipboard shrugged. Not my problem. They left with the cold following them out. The back door swung once. Exhaust and distant sirens slipped in. Sarah leaned against the sink, blinking hard. Mark didn't offer speeches. He washed his hands slow, like a ritual. Warm water, soap smell, steady breathing. Then he turned, took a pen, and wrote on a napkin. Date, time, names, plates. He slid it to Sarah. Document, he said. Emily stepped forward, voice sharp. This is retaliation. We can expose Harlow. Mark looked through the kitchen window at Eli. The boy was trying to read, but his eyes kept lifting to the door. A kid can't carry a war on his back. Mark shook his head. Not yet. First, keep them standing. Mark pulled out the storage receipt and wrote one more line for Sarah in block letters. Ask for everything in writing. Then he added, witnesses. Sarah nodded, swallowing. Emily leaned in, voice tight. I have a lawyer's number. Mark shook his head. No phones, he said. He tore a napkin, wrote a time and place, tomorrow morning, the Ore Works gate, and slid it to Emily. Rex whined once, then settled. warm flank brushing Mark's shin. The radio crackled with an old Hank Williams tune. Outside, tires hissed on slush. Mark felt the town closing in, tight around them like wire. The bell dinged out front again. Eli's voice called, small. "Mom?" Mark moved first. He pushed into the alley behind the diner. Cold bit his lungs. The alley smelled of wet cardboard and diesel. A truck idled, exhaust curling like smoke. A tall shadow stood beside it. Logan Pike turned, big shoulders, flat eyes. A cigarette ember glowed orange, and the smoke smelled sweet and stale. Eli stood a few feet away, frozen, backpack strap twisted in his fist. Pike smiled without warmth. "Evening," he said. "Mayor wants a word." Logan Pike turned, big shoulders, flat eyes. A cigarette ember glowed orange, and the smoke smelled sweet and stale. Eli stood a few feet away, frozen, backpack strap twisted in his fist. Pike smiled without warmth. "Evening," he said. "Mayor wants a word." The alley was a wind tunnel. Diesel exhaust from the idling truck rolled low and greasy along the brick walls. Snowmelt dripped from a gutter in a slow, steady tick. Mark Hayes felt the cold bite into the scar tissue in his knee like a dull knife. Rex stepped forward one pace. Not barking, just there, a quiet wall with amber eyes. Mark didn't raise his voice. He didn't puff his chest. He just moved between the man and the boy, squared away like he'd done 100 times on dusty roads far from home. His gloved hand reached back. 2 fingers touched Rex's collar. "Heel." Rex obeyed, tight, silent. The shepherd's fur brushed Mark's leg, warm through denim. A reminder, present tense. Pike took a slow drag. Ash glowed. Smoke curled into the freezing air. "Don't make this a thing," he said, voice thick like cheap whiskey. "Kid comes with me. We talk, then he walks home." Eli's breathing went fast. Mark heard it, high and thin, like a kettle about to boil. The boy's eyes darted to Rex, then to Mark, searching for orders. Mark finally spoke. 2 words. "Inside, now." Eli moved, like a soldier who'd been waiting for permission. He slipped past Mark and ran toward the diner's back door, shoes skidding on slush. The bell at the front dinged faint through the walls as another customer came and went. Warm air and the smell of bacon drifted out every time the door cracked. Pike's smile thinned. He shifted his weight. Big man. Heavy boots. A hand slid toward his coat pocket. Rex's ears snapped forward. The low rumble returned, deeper now. Pike noticed. His eyes flicked down to the dog's teeth. Mark's posture didn't change. He just looked at Pike like he was a problem to be solved, not a man to be feared. The truck behind Pike idled louder. The engine's vibration traveled through the ground. Mark felt it in his soles. Pike took 1/2 step, testing. Mark took 1/2 step too. Perfect mirror, perimeter held. Pike exhaled smoke. "You got a lot of pride for a guy sleeping in a rust pile." Mark didn't answer. Pike leaned in just enough for Mark to smell him. Tobacco, cologne, and something sour underneath. "Mayor says you're making things noisy. That's bad for business." Mark's eyes stayed steady. Pike's voice dropped. "Here's how this goes. You leave town, tonight, dog too. Or Sarah's Little Diner goes foobar, licenses, permits, inspections, accidents." He smiled again. "And kids wander into alleys." Rex's growl sharpened. Mark's fingers tightened once on the leash. Not a yank. Just a warning to himself. Don't let the leash become a fuse. A car passed at the street mouth. Tires hissed on slush. Headlights swept the alley and painted Pike's face white for a heartbeat. Then darkness returned. Mark moved his chin toward the street. One small gesture. "Walk." Pike stared, amused. "What?" Mark spoke low. "Go." It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was the same tone a sergeant uses when a situation is seconds from going sideways. Pike felt it. His smile faded. For a moment, Pike looked like he might try something anyway. Then Rex took one silent step forward and stopped. No lunge, no bark, just pressure. Pike's eyes narrowed. He backed off half a pace, like his body made the decision for his brain. "Fine," Pike said, flicking ash. "You're on borrowed time, old man." He nodded at the truck. "Tell Sarah she better keep her boy close." He climbed in. Door thumped shut. The truck rolled away, leaving a sour ribbon of exhaust and a sting of cold behind it. Mark stood still until the taillights disappeared. "Watch your six. Always." Then he turned to the back door. His knee complained when he moved. He ignored it. He pushed inside. Warm air hit his face. Grease and coffee. Lemon cleaner. The AM radio hummed in the dining room. A lonely old song cracked with static. Sarah was in the kitchen, pale, hands wet from the sink. Eli stood beside her, shaking, eyes too big. Mark didn't hug. He didn't give a speech. He checked the back lock, solid. He checked the window latch, tight. He checked the alley sightline through the small pane, clear. Then he slid a napkin onto the counter and wrote in block letters, slow and neat, "No more alley. Lights on. Stay together." Sarah swallowed hard. They grabbed him," she whispered. "I saw the truck. I thought—" Her voice broke on the last word. Mark shook his head once. "No, not today." Eli blurted, "He said, Mayor wants a word. He said accidents." The kid's voice cracked. He scrubbed at his face with his sleeve, smelling of pencil lead and winter wool. "I didn't do anything." Mark crouched. The tile was cold through his knees. He held Eli's gaze. "You listened," Mark said. 2 words of approval. That was the kind of praise a kid remembers. Eli nodded hard, like he was trying not to cry. Rex padded over and pressed his head into the boy's hip. Warm weight, steady heartbeat. Eli's shoulders dropped a fraction. The front bell dinged again. A customer laugh. Plates clinked. Normal life pretending nothing happened. Emily Grayson slipped in through the back a minute later. Cheeks red from wind, eyes alert. Her coat smelled of lake air and pine. She took one look at Sarah's face and the way Eli was shaking and her jaw tightened. "This is retaliation," she said, "because of me." Mark didn't correct her. He didn't comfort her. He simply picked up the wooden box from his pack and set it on the counter like a folded flag. Then he tapped the invisible shape of the metal case in his mind, hidden at Red Harbor, locked, heavy. Emily lowered her voice. "We need the evidence, now, before he hurts them." Mark nodded once. Oscar Mike. He looked at Sarah. He pointed at the dining room. "Close early." Sarah blinked. "I can't." Mark's stare wasn't harsh. It was certain. Sarah knew the difference between losing money and losing her son. She exhaled a shaky breath that smelled like coffee and fear. "Okay," she whispered. Mark wrote another note on a napkin and slid it to her. "If anyone asks, sick door locked." He stood. He didn't tell Emily the plan in words. He grabbed his pack. He clipped Rex's leash. He nodded to the back door. "Move." Outside, the cold hit like a slap again. The sky was iron gray. The town smelled of diesel, salt, and chimney smoke. Mark kept to side streets. He watched reflections in storefront glass. He listened to engine notes behind them. Rex's ears tracked everything. Footsteps, a distant radio, the crunch of tires on packed snow. They reached the fence gap at Red Harbor. Wind screamed through rusted beams. The air tasted like iron and old oil. Mark moved fast, not panicked, efficient, field expedient. He pried the steel plate up. Metal shrieked. His knee flared with pain. He ignored it. He hauled the black metal case out of the crawl space and wrapped it tight in his sleeping bag. Emily stared. "That's it." Mark didn't answer. He just replaced the plate, scuffed dust over it, and led them out. They didn't go to Emily's office. Too many eyes. They didn't go to Sarah's diner. Soft target. Mark headed for the industrial edge where the old bait shop sign had fallen crooked. Beyond it, a squat building with a single light in the window, Frank Mercer's place. Inside, the air smelled of coffee, machine oil, and ozone from a space heater. A police scanner sat on a shelf, humming low, voices popping through static. Frank Mercer, gray beard, tired eyes, posture still hard, looked up the second the door opened. His gaze dropped to the case, then to Rex, then back to Mark. "You're the man Sarah mentioned?" Frank said quietly. "The quiet one." Mark set the case on the workbench with a heavy thud. The metal was cold enough to burn skin. Frank ran a hand over the 3 locks. "Military grade," he muttered. "Someone wanted this to stay buried." He glanced at Emily. "You Emily Grayson?" Emily nodded, throat tight. Frank's mouth set like a line. "Then let's dig up ghosts." He worked without drama, a stethoscope, a small pick. His fingers moved with surgeon patience. Click, turn, listen, click. The room held its breath. The only sounds were the space heater hum and the faint hiss of wind outside. Rex stationed himself at the door, body low, eyes fixed on the window seam. Guard dog, without bravado. Mark didn't pace. He didn't fidget. He watched the door and the corners, scanning like it was muscle memory. Frank hit the first lock. Soft snick. Second lock. Another snick. Third lock fought him longer. 5 minutes. 10. Emily's breathing went fast. Mark's stayed slow. Finally, click. Frank lifted the lid. The smell that came out wasn't rot. It was old paper, leather, a dry, preserved time capsule. Frank pulled items out and laid them down like evidence. A ledger with names and numbers, stamped reports with suspicious seals, a folded deed with an embossed mark, and a small cassette tape in a cracked plastic sleeve. Emily's hands trembled as she touched the deed. This proves he never owned Red Harbor." Frank nodded. "It proves more than that." He tapped the ledger. "This is the money trail." Emily swallowed. "We take it to the state." Frank's eyes hardened. "Not yet, not alone. First we copy, then we lawyer up." He slid a thumb drive into a laptop. The hard drive whirred. The screen glow painted his face pale. The printer in the corner started up, clacking and whining, warm toner smell filling the room. Mark stayed silent, but his eyes kept cutting to Rex every few seconds. The dog hadn't moved, ears up, nose working. Something in the air had shifted. Frank's police scanner crackled. "Unit, Harlow, inspection team." Emily flinched. Mark's hand rose, palm down. Calm. Rex suddenly lifted his head and let out one sharp whine. Not loud, not fear, alert. Frank froze. Mark froze too. Every muscle locking like a switch flipped. He moved to the dirty window and lifted the blind a finger width. A black SUV sat across the street, engine off, 2 silhouettes inside, watching. Frank's jaw tightened. They found us. The air felt thinner. The heater hum sounded too loud. The smell of coffee turned bitter in Mark's throat. Frank snapped the lid shut on the case. "We move," he said. "Now." Mark didn't argue. He grabbed the case. Emily scooped the wooden box. Frank stuffed the cassette and copies into a canvas bag. Rex stayed at the door, body tense. A sound hit the front, metal on metal, a pry bar scraping the frame. Slow, deliberate. Like men who knew they had time. Frank hissed, "Back exit." They moved, fast and quiet. The back hall smelled of damp concrete and old paint. The rear door opened to an alley packed with snow and garbage bins. Wind slapped their faces. Diesel stink drifted in from somewhere close. Mark stepped out first. He looked left, right, clear. Then, footsteps, heavy, running. A shadow cut the corner. Logan Pike, too close. Mark shoved Emily back with his shoulder. His free hand yanked Rex's leash shorter. Rex lunged once, controlled, barking hard. One booming blast that echoed off brick like a shotgun report. Pike flinched, but a second man appeared behind him, Drew Kincaid, grinning, breath fogging, a length of cable in his hand. "Nice dog," Kincaid said. Everything went fast, foobar fast. Rex twisted to protect Mark's leg. Kincaid looped the cable low. Pike grabbed for the leash. Mark drove an elbow into Pike's chest. Short, sharp, not fancy. Pike stumbled. Mark reached for Rex, and the cable snapped tight. Rex let out one sharp yelp. The sound punched straight into Mark's ribs. Mark's fingers closed on empty air. The alley filled with exhaust and shouting. The SUV door slammed. Tires spun on slush. Rex's bark cut off mid-note. The black SUV tore away, taillights bleeding red into the snow. Mark stood there, chest heaving, breath burning his throat. Wind screamed down the alley. His knee throbbed. His hand still held the leash clip. But the weight at the other end was gone. The alley stayed cold after the taillights vanished. Diesel hung low. Snow squeaked under Mark Hayes' boots. In his fist was the empty leash clip, metal biting through his glove. His knee screamed. His lungs burned. Emily Grayson made a choked sound. Frank Mercer cursed, voice rough as sandpaper. Mark froze. Not fear, a switch. He dropped to one knee and touched the slush. Fresh tire grooves, warm rubber. The track cut toward Harbor Street. Mark's jaw tightened. Rex's yelp still rang in his ribs like a funeral drum. Frank grabbed his shoulder. "Not blind," he hissed. "They'll loop back." Mark nodded once and moved. They hustled into Frank's shop. Heat slapped their faces. The air smelled of coffee, machine oil, and hot toner. The police scanner hissed. A voice popped through. "County units, town directive, road control." Frank snapped the laptop shut, shoved files to a thumb drive, and pocketed it like a prayer. Emily hugged the wooden box to her chest. Mark lifted the black metal case. It felt heavier now, because Rex wasn't beside his leg. "Van," Frank said. "Now." Outside, sleet stung their cheeks. They climbed into Frank's old work van, reeking of wet canvas and cigarettes. Mark sat in back with the case braced against his shoulder. Rex's warmth was gone. The space felt wrong. A black SUV slid into view ahead, slow and hungry. Another set of headlights showed behind them. Frank breathed. "Foobar." Mark tapped the seat once. Left. Frank turned into a tight service lane between warehouses. Tires crunched salt. The lake wind carried fish stink and diesel. At the end of the lane, a county cruiser idled, lights off. A deputy stood in the road, radio on his shoulder, breath steaming. Mark's eyes flicked right. A drainage ditch, a culvert under the road, 2 fingers, down. Frank's hands trembled. "You sure?" Mark nodded. Frank killed the headlights and rolled. Last second, he cut right. The van dropped into the ditch with a wet slap. Mud smell. Slush sprayed the windows. They slid into the culvert. Darkness swallowed them. Water dripped. Metal scraped. Emily bit her sleeve to stay quiet. They burst out the far side behind Red Harbor Ore Works, tucked under rusted steel and broken catwalks. Wind howled through the skeleton. Frank exhaled, half laughing, half shaking. "Who trained you?" Mark didn't answer. He watched the mirrors until the SUVs blew past the roadblock, chasing air. Frank flipped on his old ham radio. Static. A faint hum. "Denise," he said when the channel cleared. "Package secured. Dog taken. Town's moving." Denise Park's voice came sharp through the crackle. "Town Hall, 8 a.m., emergency hearing. State inspector is already en route. Get copies to me. And protect the waitress and her kid. Harlow will hit them." Mark heard "kid" and saw Eli's small face. Soft target. Mark stood. Bluebird. They drove at dawn. Sleet ticked the windshield like gravel. The heater smelled of hot dust. Mark's knee throbbed with every bump, but his face stayed blank. Silent strength. Bluebird Diner looked wrong. A county pickup sat out front. 2 inspectors and a deputy blocked the door. Inside, lights flickered. The air leaking out smelled like bleach and burnt coffee. Mark stepped into the wind. Cold punched his lungs. He walked to the deputy. "Closed," the deputy said, smirking. Mark's eyes went to the man's hands. Loose, lazy. "Let her out," Mark said. The deputy laughed. "Or what?" Kincaid appeared by the pickup, smiling. "You should have left town, Sergeant." That word landed like a hammer. Sergeant. The deputy's smirk slipped. Frank's van rolled up behind. Emily stepped out, holding a folder of copied pages, bright white against gray morning. The deputy reached for his radio. Mark moved. One clean step. He hooked the wrist, turned it, and pinned the deputy against the wall with quiet pressure. No punches, no show. The man gasped and stopped fighting. Sarah opened the door from inside, trembling, smelling of coffee and fear. Eli clung to her hip, eyes wide. Mark released the deputy and stepped back, hands open. E's second cruiser slid up. Tires hissed. A younger officer jumped out, hand near his holster. He took in Mark's stance, the pinned deputy, the calm, dog-less space at Mark's side. He froze. Then his shoulders squared. His eyes caught the battered field watch on Mark's wrist, the kind you don't buy at a mall. He saluted. Quick, respectful. The sidewalk went quiet except for sleet ticking on metal and a radio hissing static. Kincaid snapped. "Don't!" The young officer's jaw tightened. "Sir, you're out of line." Mark didn't speak. He pointed Sarah and Eli toward the van. "Get in." Sarah's voice shook. "Rex." Mark's voice stayed low. "We get him." They went to the marina warehouses, where the wind cut straight off the lake, and the air stank of bait and diesel. Mark tracked the same tread pattern frozen in slush. He pointed to a corrugated door. Warehouse 12. Inside was dim, rope and oil, a tinny radio somewhere playing classic rock. Mark moved like a shadow. Frank followed, breathing loud. Emily held the flashlight, hand shaking. A cage sat behind stacked nets. Rex was inside, muzzle scraped, eyes bright. A shock collar on his neck, wires to a battery pack. Rex whined once, then pressed to the bars. Mark's throat tightened. He didn't talk. He cut the power. One snip. A spark. The hum died. He popped the collar latch and slid it off. Warm fur filled his hands. Rex shoved his head into Mark's chest, hard, like he was anchoring him back to life. Footsteps hammered outside, Kincaid shouting, "He's in there!" Frank's hands trembled. Emily's breath hitched. Mark clipped the leash. "Go," he said. They ran. A back corridor that reeked of bleach and fish. A door burst behind them. A weapon racked. Mark shoved Frank and Emily forward. At the dock edge, he yanked open a storm drain hatch. Cold metal. Slime stink. His knee flared like fire as he lifted. Down! They dropped into freezing water up to their ankles. The tunnel smelled of mud and rust. Rex stayed silent, ears pinned, trusting. Above, boots thundered, flashlights swept, voices cursed, then faded. They climbed out 2 blocks away by an abandoned ice house, soaked and shaking. Morning light crawled over the lake, gray and hard. Mark's hands shook now, cold and fury, but his eyes stayed steady on Rex. "Home," he said. Back at Red Harbor's security room, Frank lit a barrel fire. Smoke and pine tar filled the tight space. Mark rubbed Rex's wet coat with a towel until steam rose off fur. Rex shivered once, then leaned into Mark's knee, breathing slow. Emily watched, eyes glassy, steadying. At Town Hall, the air smelled of wet coats and old wood polish. The room buzzed with anger, radios crackling. Sarah sat with Eli, fingers locked tight. Emily held the copies. Frank stood behind them like a guardrail. Denise Park entered, suit crisp, eyes sharp. She nodded once at Mark. No pity, respect. Then the doors opened again. Mayor Clay Harlow walked in, smiling like he owned the place. Town Hall smelled of wet wool, floor polish, and burnt coffee from a percolator. Coats steamed, boots squeaked on varnished boards. A space heater hummed, fighting the lake wind that pressed cold air through the window seams. Harlow's suit was spotless. His cheeks were pink from the heat, not the cold. Drew Kincaid trailed him, chewing gum, eyes mean. Logan Pike planted himself by the doors, big as a refrigerator. In the second row, Sarah Whitaker held Eli close. The boy's hands were chapped and shaking. At Mark Hayes's boot, Rex lay quiet, fur still carrying a faint smell of rust water and barrel smoke. Denise Park stood. "Mr. Mayor," she said, "this hearing is on the record." Harlow's smile widened. Denise, always stirring the pot. His gaze slid to Mark. "And who's this? Another drifter looking for a handout?" Mark didn't answer. He stayed squared away. Rex's ears flicked, then settled. Emily Grayson stepped beside Denise, clutching a folder of copies. Fresh toner smell rose when she opened it. Frank Mercer sat behind them with a canvas bag on his lap, eyes like flint. Harlow tapped the mic. It squealed. "Folks, we've got a trespasser problem, stolen papers, a dangerous dog, lies meant to derail progress at Red Harbor." Murmurs rolled. A plow outside groaned past, brakes hissing. Psh! Sharp through the glass. Mark's jaw tightened. The old memory tried to surge. Rex pressed warm weight into Mark's shin, grounding, present. Denise didn't blink. "This isn't about progress. It's about fraud and a death disguised as operator error." Harlow chuckled. "Ancient history." Denise opened the black metal case on the clerk's table. The lid clacked heavy. Inside, a folded deed with an embossed seal, a ledger thick as a brick, and a cassette in a clear sleeve. The room leaned in. Paper and old leather smelled dry and preserved. Harlow's smile thinned. "What is that?" Denise slid the deed forward. Original title: Red Harbor was never legally transferred to your shell company. It is not yours. Kincaid shifted, eyes darting. Pike's shoulders rolled like he wanted to start trouble. Denise lifted the ledger. Payment log, dates, names, cash drops to inspectors and county liaison. Someone in the back whispered, "That's my brother's name." Harlow snapped, "Fake." Frank Mercer spoke once, voice gravelly. "It's real. I verified the paper stock and ink, and I made copies." Denise slid a small tape recorder onto the table. The plastic smelled like warm electronics. She pressed play. A thin hiss filled the speakers, tape static, then a familiar voice, smooth and cold. "Nathan, you sign, or you'll have an accident. Gas leak, closed file." The room went dead silent. You could hear the percolator bubble and the heater hum. Sarah's hand flew to Eli's shoulder. Eli's eyes went huge. Emily's face drained white, like all the air had been sucked out of her. Harlow's smile finally cracked. Harlow's face hardened. He flicked 2 fingers at Kincaid. "Get that box." Kincaid strode down the aisle. He reached for the case. Rex rose. Not wild, not barking, just up, shoulders square, a low rumble rolling out like thunder under a bridge. Kincaid froze mid-step, throat bobbing. "Move!" Harlow hissed. Kincaid tried anyway. His hand swung toward the evidence. Mark stood. 1 step, 1 clean pivot. He caught the wrist, turned it down, and pinned Kincaid to the floor without a punch. Shoes scraped. The mic picked up Kincaid's sharp breath. The crowd gasped. Near the wall, Officer Harris, young, straight-backed, took a step forward. "Sir," he said to Harlow, voice steady, "stand down." Harlow barked, "That's an order." For a beat, The only sound was the heater hum and the percolator bubbling. Harris looked at Mark's stance, then at Rex's discipline. Harris saluted Mark. Quick, respectful. "I don't take orders from criminals," Harris said. The room erupted, chairs scraping, angry voices, a wave of breath and sweat rising in the warm air. Then the doors banged open. Cold air punched in, carrying diesel, snow, and wet metal. 2 state troopers stepped inside, with a woman in a winter coat and clipboard. "I'm Inspector Marlene Shaw," she said. "State Public Integrity. We received an emergency filing and supporting evidence." Denise nodded once. "Right here." Shaw flipped through the deed and ledger. Pages rustled like leaves. She looked up at Harlow. "Mayor Harlow, you are under investigation for bribery, fraud, and intimidation of witnesses." Harlow tried to laugh. "This is politics." Shaw's eyes stayed flat. "It's handcuffs." Troopers moved. Pike shifted by the doors, hand dipping inside his coat. Rex barked once, deep, commanding. Mark stepped between Pike and Sarah's row, feet planted, shoulders square. A human shield. Rex stood tight at his knee. "Hands out!" a trooper ordered. Pike hesitated, then raised empty palms. The cuffs clicked onto his wrists. Kincaid was cuffed next, then Harlow. Harlow's swagger collapsed into rage. "You people need me!" The cuffs clicked, metal on bone, a sound the whole town understood. Sarah let out a shaking breath that smelled of coffee and relief. Eli grabbed her sleeve, eyes wide, and then looked at Mark like he'd finally found the adult who doesn't lie. Inspector Shaw faced the room. "This hearing is suspended. All Red Harbor contracts tied to the mayor's office are frozen. Title restoration proceedings begin immediately." Emily covered her mouth. Tears ran hot on cold cheeks. Denise leaned close to Mark. "You did good," she said. Mark nodded once, silent, squared away. Outside, sirens Dopplered Harbor Street. Exhaust curled in the cold. Rex leaned into Mark's leg. Warm fur, steady breath. Mark finally unclenched his fist. 3 months later, Red Harbor smelled different. Still iron and lake wind, but now mixed with fresh-cut lumber and wet paint. Generators hummed. Hammers tapped. A radio played old country without static. A new sign hung on the repaired fence. Red Harbor Community Works. At the fence, Emily met him with a grateful look. "My dad wanted a place that served people," she said. "I need someone who can keep it safe. Job's yours if you want it." Mark glanced at Rex, felt warm breath on his hand, then gave one small nod. Mark wore a clean work shirt with a stitched patch, site security. His knee still ached on bad weather days, but the ache didn't own him. Rex wore a new collar tag that read, "K9 Companion." Bluebird Diner stayed open. Its windows glowed warm. Bacon and coffee drifted into the street. On Fridays, veterans sat in the back booth, swapping stories over decaf. No shame, no pity. Sarah laughed more. Eli stood straighter. On a quiet evening, snow falling soft, Mark locked the Red Harbor gate and walked upstairs to the small apartment above the refurbished security office. Heat rolled out when he opened the door. The fridge hummed. Rex padded in first, nails clicking on new tile. Mark stopped at the threshold and listened. No boots chasing, no orders from crooked men, just the low radio from the diner down the street and Rex's steady breathing. For the first time in a long time, the world felt squared away.